slogan. We officially start the press conference of the Democracy in Europe movement. This is Yanis Varoufakis. As you probably know, my name is Srecko Horvat. We are only one of the representatives of many people who already joined the movement, and today during the day you will see what it is about. And we have half an hour for the press conference, and later we must continue with our strategical meetings. So, just a short introduction. In 1969, Theodor Adorno gave an interview for Den Spiegel, and the journalist asked the question, Herr Professor, vor 2 Monaten schien die Welt noch in Ordnung. And you know what Adorno answered? Adorno answered, mir nicht. And I think it's the same. Maybe to some people, the European Union seemed to be fine, but for us, and especially from Yanis' experience as the Greek finance minister, it didn't seem in Ordnung zu sein. Last year, the German Society for Language announced that they are, I hope it's them? No. They announced that the 3 most popular words of the last year were on the first place, Flüchtlinge, refugees, on the second place, Je suis Charlie, and on the third place, Brexit. On the 10th place, it was Wir können es schaffen. I think, which is Merkel's quote regarding the refugee crisis. What we want to do is actually to put Wir können es schaffen on the first place, and that's the reason why we are founding, together with other comrades from all around Europe, the Democracy in Europe movement. But I will give you the word now, and then we answer questions. I think it's better for the press conference.
Well, let me welcome you to this press conference. Thank you so much for coming. It's a great honor, a privilege to be in the heart of Europe, in Berlin. We've chosen Berlin precisely because nothing can change in a progressive direction without the full participation of Germany in our European endeavors. Unfortunately, it is the conviction of some of us, those of us who are putting DM together, that the European Union is disintegrating, and it is doing so quite fast. Whether you're talking about the Euro crisis, the failure, the spectacular failure of the European Union, both as a union and also as its constituent members, to deal with the refugee crisis in a sensible, rational, humanist way, with the possible exception of Angela Merkel, who's been very good on this. The phenomenon of the renationalization of ambition, the nationalization of hope, the fact that we now have European governments adopting fully the not in my backyard mentality, whether this is about debt, about refugees, about Schengen, about geopolitics, about our attitude to the Middle East, to Libya. You only have to put together the words European, foreign and policy to end up with a joke, or the words European migration and policy to end up with a joke. Why is Europe disintegrating? The long and the short of it is that we have allowed, for the last decade, 2 decades, possibly 3 decades, a process of depoliticizing decision-making at the heart of Europe, in our core European institutions. And when you depoliticize a political decision process, you end up with very bad politics and substandard economic policies. And now we have, this is at least our estimation, a vicious cycle. Bad policy leads to bad economic outcomes like negative interest rates facing pension funds in Germany or deflation in Spain. These bad economic outcomes give the bureaucratic, technocratic decision-making process more of an incentive to turn to further degrees of authoritarianism. The extra degrees of authoritarianism lead to more entrenchment in the bad policy framework, which leads to further bad outcomes. And we are in a kind of early 1930s framework of disintegration. You add to this mix an exogenous shock like the refugees, and you end up with a situation we're facing in Europe today. So we ask ourselves a very simple question. If our analysis is right, if the European Union is disintegrating because of its terrible governance and architecture, what is the solution? Well, we know what is not the solution. The solution is not to return to the nation state. The solution is not to build walls again. The solution is not Fortress Germany, Fortress France, Fortress Greece, fortresses everywhere. Those walls simply reflect our insecurity and our failures. That's not the solution. It is also not the solution, ostrich-like, to bury our heads in the sand, to pretend that we are on the right path and we only need to tweak our policies a little bit. So if these are not the solutions, what are the solutions? Well, our answer to this poignant question is a search for democratizing European Union institutions to achieve two things. Firstly, to recalibrate existing institutions and policies in order to stabilize the 5 crises that are disintegrating Europe. Debt, banking, low investment everywhere, including in Germany, rising poverty, which fuels misanthropy and ultranationalism, and migration. And to do this in a way that re-legitimizes political power and repoliticizes politics in Europe. How can this happen? The old-fashioned system of creating a political party in the context of the nation state, making promises that you cannot fulfill once you are in power, if you ever gain government, that system is finished. I have watched mighty finance ministers, including these countries, being reduced to a state of helplessness in the context of the European Union Council, in the context of the Eurogroup. So if we are right that another political party, another organization in the context of the nation state is the wrong way to go, what is the only alternative? The only alternative is to try something we've never tried before. A political movement that starts everywhere in Europe at once, cross-border, independently of prior political party affiliations, that has one simple objective: to get Europeans around a metaphorical table, digital table, in forums like this one tonight, to discuss as Europeans their common problems and what we want our common solutions to these common problems to be. The hope is that if a consensus emerges, then that consensus will find ways of expressing itself at the level of the municipality, of the region, of the state, of the European Union. We are very much looking forward to answering your many and pressing questions.
So let's start with the question there, yeah.
Please. Peter Alder, Marty International. President Erdogan of Turkey has today, it seems, threatened Europe, saying that if Turkey doesn't receive financing, he will send masses of refugees towards the EU. How do these type of threats challenge the aims that you're putting forward?
These threats, the clear and present dangers that we're facing, enhance the point. It is about time that we decided to treat the problem as a common one, not as a Greek problem, not as a problem to be sorted out by turning Greece or Italy or Sicily into a concentration camp, but as the common problem of a large union, a powerful union, a rich union, which has failed spectacularly over the last weeks, months and years to deal with common problems, systemic problems, systematically. So the whole raison d'etre of what we're doing is to be able to look Mr. Erdogan in the eye as Europeans with a coherent policy, which is consistent also with coherent policies in the realm of solidarity within Europe, economic stabilization, and an end to the race to the bottom, which is forcing Europe into the bosom of disintegration.
But sorry, just as a quick follow-up, it doesn't help when you're playing brinkmanship with these type of stakes, does it? When you're trying to deal as a Europe, but your partners outside of Europe are willing to hold this gun to your head.
Well, unity is strength. When a gun is being held to a head, the last thing we need is a situation where Berlin turns against Athens, Athens turns against Paris, Paris turns against Bratislava.
Okay, the next question, please, the man behind you.
You said you wanted to start a movement in all European countries at once. What makes you believe that you can achieve what all social movements, protest movements, or attack, for example, has not achieved so far and has bitterly failed?
Absolutely nothing. But it's the only way I can wake up in the morning and be energized to do that which I think is right. Look, Harald, 2015 was a pivotal year. It was a year when we failed as Europe quite substantially to deal with an economic policy which condemned large parts of the periphery to permanent depression, while at the very same time condemning surplus economies, core economies like Germany, like the Netherlands and so on, to a slow-burning, deflationary process which is undermining confidence in the core countries regarding the capacity of the European Union and governments in Berlin, in the Netherlands and so on, to deal with the situation. For the very first time, let me just say one thing, Srecko. For the very first time, there is the possibility of a coalition of Democrats, whether they are liberal Democrats, social Democrats, radical Democrats, green Democrats. 2015 has pointed out to many people that our system of governance in Europe is not consistent with shared prosperity. Now, maybe what we're doing is going to allow this coalition to come into being, something that previous movements have not succeeded in doing. Remember that defenders of capitalism, of the free market, keep put forward the view that the reason that capitalism is dynamic is because it's a trial and error process, where the market determines, out of many failures, what the success story is. Well, maybe we need to try out many different movements in order to come to the one that allows Europe to integrate as opposed to disintegrate. Maybe this movement will also be a failure, as you say. But we have to keep trying until the evolutionary process, the historical process in Europe, is put into the direction, into the pathway towards integration and in a mode that arrests the current deconstruction.
Okay, we take one more question from the right, and then we turn to the left. It's you, yeah, please.
My name is Raza. I'm from acTVism Munich. I wanted to ask you about media terminology and Orwellianism. The corporate media here in Germany and in the US uses terms like structural adjustments, labor market flexibility, rescue packages as if the whole nation was rescued, savings program. Noam Chomsky says labor market flexibility is another term for a person not knowing if you wake up tomorrow with a job. So I want to ask you if your movement will take these terminologies and change them around to provide a more accurate depiction to what's happening on ground.
Well, we should all, every single one of us, beware Orwellian doublespeak and the way in which language is twisted in order to hide what's underlying particular sentences and policies, and effectively to throw rays of light and transparency on what people actually mean. Would it not be good if our language was useful in the context of a dialogue so that what we meant was conveyed to our interlocutors? My favorite one is example of such doublespeak. During our negotiations with the Troika, the term they used for reducing pensions, intergenerational restoration of justice.
Okay, please.
Your political profile is on the radical left, more or less. How do you plan to address and reach a wider political spectrum?
Well, if you read our manifesto, it is quite clear that it's a manifesto for the democratization of Europe, and it is an open call to all Democrats, independently of ideologies, conceptions of the good society, political party affiliation. Now, I, of course, like you, like all of us, we have our particular prejudices, our particular ideological take. But Diem is not me, it's not Srecko, it's not any of the people who will be at the Volksbühne tonight. It's all of us together, and it is its manifesto. It's as good as the word of the manifesto that it seeks to embrace everyone who cares about re-democratizing, putting the demos back into democracy in Europe.
So you really think that center-left, center-right will participate in the movement?
This is what we want. You see, some of my greatest political friends, associates, if you want, collaborators, are people who would be described in Britain as Thatcherites, as neoliberals, people who are incensed by the vacuum of democracy, the lack of democracy in Brussels, in Frankfurt, in the institutions of Europe, which are doing such a bad job at managing Europe. If I can be friends with these people, I think it is perfectly possible for DiEM to embrace everyone who simply agrees on the necessity of politicizing politics in order to arrest the economic crisis and the crisis of excessive authoritarianism in this democracy-free zone, which is Brussels and Frankfurt.
Okay, please, if you can, everyone raise the hands again so we can see how many questions do we have. Okay. So now we move behind and then we come, please, the gentleman there. Yes.
Versus acTV. Does this repoliticization mean also to defend the constitutions of the member states?
The problem with, of course, I mean, we are constitutionalist Democrats. But let me say this to you, sir. The moment we created a common currency, we transferred sovereignty from our nation states into a black hole. We didn't create a federation. If we had created a federal government, we had transferred our sovereignty from the nation state to the federal state, and we would need a constitution to do that. That would be overarching and towering above the constitutions of our nation states. We didn't do that. So now there's no sovereignty. Now there's just opacity, there is authoritarianism, there are officials that you, or maybe you know, who they are and what they are called, but the crashing majority of Europeans have never even seen their face or heard their names, who make important, crucial decisions behind their backs. And the problem is that the vast majority of Europeans, whether they agree with me or not, feel that there is this lack of legitimacy. The problem with this is that in the context of a deflationary spiral, with refugee crises that are not being dealt with collectively, there is a very serious danger that this discontent for the lack of legitimacy and the disrespect to the constitutions without having an overarching federal constitution leads to disintegration, to nationalism, to an attempt to recoil back into the nation state, and in other words, to put it very succinctly, a postmodern version of the 1930s. Democrats must stop this. We must give the average people out there, especially those who would never want to hear anything from me, or people like me, we must give them hope that Europe can rise up to the occasion of reclaiming constitutional democratic processes in a way that is consistent with their anxieties and aspirations.
Okay, we go with the lady behind the camera.
I still wonder why we need your movement, this new movement, as we have other political, left-wing political parties who fight for democracy, who fight for repoliticization. So that's...
I hope, you know, it would be a dream for me not to have to do this. It would be great if existing movements could have done the job, but I don't feel they can. And I don't believe a left-wing movement can do it. Look, I'm a left-winger, I make no bones about that, I think you all know this. But I have to be brutally honest. The left suffered a major defeat in the late 1980s, early 1990s. We carry a major burden of guilt for all the crimes that we carried out as leftists, not as individuals, the collective guilt of the left over the 20th century. The left has not succeeded since 1991, and especially after 2008, the great financial crisis, which it was the impetus, the trigger for the crisis of the euro, the crisis of the European Union now. We have failed as the left to break out of that past, to break out of the very strict confines of a minority. We did this in Greece, briefly, but this was not replicated in Germany, it was not replicated in France. The issues that we're facing, however, just like in the 1930s, are issues that are existentialist for the survival of Europe and go beyond the limitations of the left. This is why we're calling for a broad coalition of liberal, social, leftist, radical, green Democrats who agree on one simple idea, that the demos must be central in a democracy and not be treated with contempt by bureaucrats that have usurped power without anyone even having noticed.
Please.
My name is Annie and I'm from Sweden. I would like to ask, as the refugee situation has already been mentioned as a threat several times, I wonder if it's possible, if you view it possible for your movement to put this in the center as a positive thing, as a common project for Europe, as population growth, rather than just a threat.
If you read our manifesto, it's very clear on this. One of the epithets we attach to the Europe of our dreams and our aspirations is an open Europe. A Europe that understands that fences and borders reflect insecurity and spread insecurity in the name of security. Speaking as Yanis Varoufakis now, not as DM, because DM has to be genuinely democratic and therefore we have to convene sessions on this before we have a position on that, but I'll speak to you now personally, not as a representative of DM. 2 points about refugees. Firstly, from the ancient Greek tradition of philoxenia, when somebody knocks on your door in the middle of the night, they're wet and they're hungry and they're blooded and scared, you don't do a cost-benefit analysis to find out whether you should open the door. You just open it. And you worry about the repercussions of what you've done much later, after that person is dry, fed, watered, and not scared. Point number one. Point number two. Europe must come to terms with its history. For hundreds of years, we have populated the earth. We have exported Europeans to the Americas, to Australia, to Asia, to Africa. We have colonized. We've killed off tribes, and we've taken over the world. And that was fine. It was part of the great European exodus. Well, you know what? Guess what? The demographics of the planet are now changing. And Europe is going to be repopulated to a very large extent by people from outside of Europe. We better accept that. Learn to live with it and learn to draw from it all the energy that we can. We are aging Europe and concentrate on how to handle this. What policies are needed in order to make this dynamic transition come much closer to humanist values and to European values.
The gentleman in the back, yeah, and then.
Thank you, Mr. Varoufakis. George again in the Central TV. Excellent focus. I would like to ask, while reading your manifesto, I saw some short-term goals like transparency and openness for the civilians, and some middle-term goals like constitutional assembly directly elected from the people of Europe. So could you please address the means you have in order to ask for leverage for the achievement of those goals in the European context?
We have no means whatsoever. We're starting tonight. Before tonight, we don't exist. Therefore, we have no leverage. This is the whole point about the movement. You state principles, you state objectives. You call upon fellow citizens from all over Europe to join in if they think that there is a lacuna, that there is a dearth, that there is a lack, and that they feel that they need to come with you and promote collectively those objectives. So our leverage will be absolutely proportional to the number of people that join DM and take an active part in the pursuit of our common objectives. That's democracy.
Mr. Varoufakis, I came from Lesbos once more. Now you find a very much militarization in Lesbos.
My question is, it's not only a European question. We have not a crisis in refugees, we have a political crisis. My question to you is, what is your answer to find a way now in this situation, because we don't find Europe, no institution, only volunteers are working, but now the volunteers, they should be obeyed. They come from all over the world. I want to hear from you more concrete what you can say, appeal here in the evening to go another way, not in the militarization, and to find a political way to solve the problem. It's a very big problem. Weapons and all these things happens in economy. But it's really a time for act now.
Precisely. This failure that you just described is a fundamental reason why we believe we need a new movement in Europe that offers Europeans an opportunity to discuss this as Europeans, not as Greeks or as Germans or as Slovaks. But allow me, this is not the time to articulate a fully fledged policy response, but allow me to make a very simple point. Last summer, our government in Greece, since you talked about Lesbos, was forced to capitulate to a deal that lends our bankrupt government another 85 billion. Before that, we were forced as a nation to accept, against the protestations of many of us on the streets, 130 billion in 2012. In 2010, we were forced to accept another 110 billion, all in supposedly as part of a solidarity to Greece, solidarity for the bankers, but anyway. If all those tens and hundreds of billions can be forced down the throat of a nation that simply can't afford them, surely we could find one or two by which to make this humanitarian part of the crisis go away in the most humane way, in a way that does not constitute a stepping stone towards militarization. The fact that we're squabbling over a few hundreds of thousands of euros, when at the very same time bailouts of hundreds of billions of toxic loans are being bandied about with abandon, this is another sign of the disintegration of the European Union. History is going to pass very harsh judgment on us.
Mr. Varoufakis, you always talk about making European Union more democratic. Perhaps it can't be more democratic. For example, the Communist Party of Greece calls Greece to leave the European Union.
Let me put it very succinctly. Maybe we should not have created the European Union the way we did. I'm convinced we shouldn't. We should have either not created or created it very differently. But once we've created it, sir, the disintegration of the European Union is going to bring about a very rapid collapse that will resemble, in terrible ways, what happened in the 1930s. And what I respond to my friends in the Communist Party, in radical parts of the left, who are articulating the position that maybe disintegration, going back to our national currencies, to our nation state and so on, is the solution, is I remind them that when we had such disintegration in the 1930s, it was not humanism, and it was not the left that benefited. It was the fascists and it was the Nazis. And Europe fell into a terrible trap with immense human costs. Do we want the same? I certainly don't.
Okay, we have time for one last question, unfortunately. Those who didn't have a chance to pose questions, we invite you all, if you are accredited, to join us in the evening. If you don't have a ticket yet, we organize live stream for more than 20,000, 50,000 people who will watch us in the world. So one last question, the first row, and then we have to finish, unfortunately. You, yes.
How are you going to engage the people from like also small countries like Slovenia, for example? Are there going to be things on the local level that they could do, or is it just going to be like these great general ideas or leaders at the...
We are great believers in acting locally in the context of an overarching pan-European agenda. So there will be many different layers of participation. There will be an application, an app on people's phone. There will be the website, so the digital platform, which is these days essentially in anything one does at the collective or even at the individual level. Those that digital platform will allow people in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, to find out who is around them that is engaged. Our idea is to move very quickly from these forms of digital communication to town hall events in towns, in villages, in cities, on themes that we decide collectively throughout Europe, leading to bigger events like the one we're having today, on a rolling basis, so that the digital communication can become analog and take the form of face-to-face meetings at the level of the local, the state, and the pan-European.
Thanks a lot. Maybe, Yanis, you want a final message, or?
Well, the final message is that there is absolutely no doubt that what we're doing with DiEM seems quite utopian. The idea of starting a European movement, not from a particular country, not from any existing organizational basis, but from a horizontal perspective throughout Europe, in order to change Europe and to stop the descent into this hole that disintegration is opening up for us. It sounds pretty far-fetched, and it may very well fail. But what is the alternative? The alternative is either to keep pretending, as the powers that be in the European Union are doing, that they can maintain this European Union that we now have. They can't. That's far more utopian than what we're doing. And finally, the alternative to this utopian project is a horrible dystopia that is going to punish severely everyone, except those who flourish and find ways of profiting from human disasters. Thank you very much.